Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping straight into Chapter 466, Cannabis and Cannabis Use Disorder. We're skipping the basic intro stuff because, let's face it, we all know the landscape of this topic is shifting rapidly. Instead, we're going to get right into the postgraduate level clinical realities. We're talking the hardcore neurobiology, the pharmacokinetics, and exactly what happens physiologically when these compounds enter the human body.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Epidemiology and potency trends. 2. Neurobiology of reward. 3. Pharmacokinetics and metabolism. 4. Neurodevelopmental impacts. And 5. Cannabis use disorder.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Epidemiology and Potency Trends.
To give us a real sense of scale right out of the gate, recent estimates from the 2023 National Survey on Drug Use and Health show that a staggering 42 million people in the United States used marijuana in just the last month. I mean, that is a massive slice of the population interacting with these pharmacologically active compounds on a routine basis.
But here is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, a bit concerning. Out of those 42 million monthly consumers, a full 10 million are between the ages of 12 and 25. We absolutely have to keep this younger demographic in mind because, as we'll dive into a bit later, a developing brain handles early exposure very differently than a fully mature one.
You know, a lot of the current landscape comes down to one really specific legal definition. The 2018 Agriculture Improvement Act set a strict 0.3% threshold for Delta-9 THC by dry weight. If a plant has more than 0.3%, it's legally classified as intoxicating marijuana. Anything below that, federally legal hemp. But get this, processors found a wild loophole. Because the law focuses strictly on plant weight and Delta-9 specifically, they're derivatizing legal hemp into other psychoactive compounds, like Delta-8 THC. So, they're completely sidestepping the federal restriction while still delivering an intoxicating product.
And the products themselves? Legalization has driven a total explosion in ultra-high potency options. We are way past historical norms here. While traditional hemp sits below that 0.3% mark, today's legal dispensary flower routinely clocks in at 20 to 30% Delta-9 THC. Vape pen liquids, they can hit up to 75%. And solid extracts, stuff like shatter used for dabbing at high temperatures, can theoretically reach up to 95% pure Delta-9 THC. This isn't just some minor bump in strength, it's a massive spike in dose delivery, which absolutely ramps up the risk for acute toxicity and addiction.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Neurobiology of Reward and Anxiety. Let's actually trace what happens inside the brain's limbic system. When THC hits the midbrain, specifically the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, it completely tweaks your glutamatergic and GABAergic activity. This fires off dopaminergic projections straight into the nucleus accumbens. And that specific interaction, that's exactly what drives the rewarding euphorogenic high. But THC doesn't stop there. It also acts heavily on the amygdala, the brain's threat perception center. Now, while low doses might take the edge off and relieve anxiety, high doses overstimulate the amygdala. That is precisely why you see severe anxiety, paranoia, and panic attacks with overconsumption.
So why does the brain react so intensely? Well, it all comes down to our endogenous cannabinoid system. Normally, our bodies produce endocannabinoids on demand. Think of them like a perfectly fitted key. They offer this subtle, just-in-time regulatory signal to keep our synapses balanced. But exogenous THC, it's literally like taking a sledgehammer to the system. It floods those exact excitatory glutamatergic and inhibitory GABAergic interneurons with an inflexible, prolonged signal. It essentially hijacks what is meant to be a delicate, finely tuned regulatory loop.
Let's shift gears into Section 3, Pharmacokinetics and Metabolism. How does the body actually process these sledgehammers?
It really depends on how it's consumed. When someone smokes or vapes, absorption into the blood is super rapid. But there is a fascinating catch here. THC undergoes a 6-minute alpha distribution phase where it moves into highly lipophilic or fat-loving tissues like the brain. This creates a really interesting temporal lag. Plasma levels in the blood might actually be dropping while brain levels are still going up. That explains why the subjective high doesn't actually peak until 20 to 30 minutes after inhalation. Now compare that to standard oral edibles. They have a notoriously low bioavailability, just 5 to 6%, simply because they have to run the gauntlet of extensive first-pass metabolism in the liver before ever hitting the bloodstream.
And as the body tries to eliminate THC, the liver puts it through a two-step conversion. First, it converts it into 11-hydroxy-THC. Now, this metabolite is still pharmacologically active, meaning it keeps producing effects. Then it gets broken down again into 11-norcarboxy-THC. This second metabolite is totally inactive, but, and this is key, it's highly lipophilic. It binds to fat cells and just lingers there for weeks, especially in frequent users. And fun fact, this lingering inactive metabolite is exactly what standard urinalysis drug tests are actually looking for.
Now, remember that super low 5% bioavailability for edibles I just mentioned? Yeah, you can completely throw that out the window if you consume THC alongside a high-fat meal. Let's say you eat an edible right after a greasy cheeseburger. The dietary fat actually stimulates bile release in your digestive tract. This emulsifies the fat-associated cannabinoids, and your enterocytes absorb them directly into the lymphatic lacteals. By hitching a ride on the lymphatic system, these molecules completely bypass that first-pass destruction in the liver. The end result? A massive, entirely unpredictable spike in bioavailability by up to 200 to 400%. This metabolic detour is a huge reason why naive users so often accidentally overdose on edibles. It just hits them way harder than they expect.
Moving on to Section 4, Neurodevelopmental Impacts.
We absolutely have to talk about what this means for the developing brain. During fetal development, natural endocannabinoids are crucial for guiding neuronal migration and wiring up the brain. When exogenous THC crosses the placenta, it severely disrupts these delicate pathways. Clinical data gives us substantial evidence linking maternal marijuana use to lower birth weights and restricted fetal growth. Plus, animal models strongly suggest that this early interference can lock in permanent, lifelong cognitive and memory deficits. It's a critical vulnerability window.
And this disruption doesn't just magically stop at birth. It carries right into childhood and adolescence. The ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, tracked nearly 12,000 kids. They found that early THC exposure was linked to increased intracranial volumes and a blunted development of visuospatial processing. Even more concerning, they found small but highly significant disruptions in white matter integrity. Specifically, it targeted the fornix. The fornix is basically the brain's superhighway for processing emotion and memory, so structural changes there are a very big deal.
Finally, let's tackle Section 5, Cannabis Use Disorder and Withdrawal.
The DSM-5 diagnostic criteria are incredibly rigorous here. Cannabis use disorder, or CUD, isn't just a casual habit. It is defined as a severe clinical impairment. We're talking about a persistent failure to fulfill major role obligations, intense drug cravings, and a profound physical tolerance to the drug's effects. And frankly, the risk for developing CUDs skyrockets with early age initiation, frequent consumption, and of course, exposure to those ultra-high-potency strains and concentrates we talked about earlier. Now, chronic use heavily downregulates cannabinoid receptor density in the brain. But mapping out the clinical timeline of recovery shows just how incredibly resilient the human brain actually is. When a frequent user stops, they'll hit the absolute peak of withdrawal within 1 to 3 days, battling severe anxiety, insomnia, restlessness, and depression. It's a really tough window. But push past that, and by the 2-week mark, most of those physical and depressive symptoms start to resolve. And the really amazing part? Within just 28 days of abstinence, the brain's cannabinoid receptor density rapidly recovers, bouncing right back to a normal baseline that basically matches non-users. That is some incredible neuroplasticity.
So, this leaves us with a critical question to consider about the intersection of emerging legalization and the rigorous clinical realities we've just mapped out. Think about everything we covered. We've got 95% THC shatter aggressively altering reward circuitry. We've got edibles capable of spiking bioavailability by 400% just by hijacking the lymphatic system. And we know the developing fornix is uniquely, structurally vulnerable to early exposure. As these highly potent products reach tens of millions of new consumers globally, we have to ask ourselves, are our current treatment algorithms, diagnostic criteria, and public health frameworks really prepared to handle this unprecedented shift in human pharmacology? It's a massive challenge, for sure. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you some real postgraduate level insight into the science of cannabis.